Your kids could get free or low-cost health coverage from Medicaid or CHIP. Even if you've applied before, they may be eligible now. Kids up to age 19 are covered for checkups, vaccines, dentist visits, hospital care, and more. And if they already have Medicaid or CHIP, remember to renew every year. Visit insurekidsnow.gov or call 877-KIDS-NOW. Paid for by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Well, howdy, folks, and welcome back to the Conspiracy Farm. We're going to jump back into the revelation to John. We're going to be getting more revelations of the apocalypse. And remember that apocalypse is just the Greek word for revelation, so that's a bit of a joke. And thus far, John has followed a being up into the sky through a door that took him to a kind of enormous celestial throne room of God the Father. And he described the various beings that are in the room and the worship activities that occur in the chamber. And we have met this being that looks like a lamb that was slaughtered, but now is standing. And this appears to be metaphorical to some extent, because this lamb can apparently stand and walk and use language and also can hold and open scrolls. And so this being, this slaughtered lamb that has stood up again, is going to be opening some seals, and some strange things happen when you break the seals on this particular scroll. We'll find out what those strange things are today. So let's go back to that night in 95 AD, somewhere in Ephesus, when the first church elders received copies of John's letter. And they eagerly broke the seal on the letter to see what John had been thinking and doing and writing during his absence. Let's jump right back in. In God's throne room, John sees that there is a scroll that has been sealed with 7 seals. A very structured, secret, official, powerful image for someone from the 1st century AD. So let's hear what happens next.
Then I saw the Lamb break one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 creatures say, "Come," with a voice like thunder. I looked, and I saw a white horse. The one sitting on the horse carried a bow. He was given a crown, and he rode off to victory and conquest.
Okay. So we have our first rider of the apocalypse. And of course, there has been endless debate about exactly what these guys represent. And this first rider is deceptively simple. But there are some things we can point out here. If we think back to the Hagakure, I talked about how the samurai would work on their mounted archery, and how hitting a target from horseback at a gallop was something that the samurai worked on, and they were proud of that skill. I may have mentioned that in the Western world, things were slightly different. In the West, and in the context of the revelation to John here, a person riding a horse with a bow is indicative of Eastern Asian nomads. In other words, the Medes, which were the horseback fighting tribes that made up the bulk of the Persian Empire's military forces, or our good friends, the Germanic nomads from Central Asia, who certainly used horsebound archers more than, say, the Romans did. And then, of course, the Mongols and the Huns were famous for relying heavily on those short, compact bows that could be used from horseback. And so This being that is being summoned here, this force of nature or of history, is not one that comes from the West. It's not a settled Roman Western power. This is a force that is coming from the East. This is an unpredictable force from Central Asia. There's no implication that the being here is inherently evil. In fact, the white horse and the crown are very positive images, especially compared to what we're going to see later on. One thing we will hear later on is an extra thing that we see in the King James Version of Revelation. Some Greek manuscripts have the living creatures. When the four creatures introduce the writers, they'll say, "Come," with a voice like thunder. Now, some Greek manuscripts have an additional word after that make them read, "Come out and behold," or "Come and see." Most manuscripts don't have that, and the Nestle Aland Greek New Testament that I'm using also doesn't have that. In any case, we can see that this is a command that is spoken from the living being to the horseman who rides the horse out when he hears the command. And John is careful here to show us that this horseman is being given power and a mission. And the order, "Come," is John's way of showing us that whatever this horseman is going to do, he may not be serving God directly, but he's been given a cue, a historical time to do what they're going to do. And it's all being directed at the highest level by God the Father. And so I think a lot of the imagery here is designed to underline the intent and the plan. And riders on white horses who are gathering victories and conquest for themselves. That's definitely a trope we see all through Roman history. They were constantly in fear of what they may have to deal with from the east. And so let's see what happens next.
Then, when the Lamb broke the second seal, I heard the second creature say, "Come." This time, a red horse rode out, and its rider was given the power to steal peace from the earth, so that people will kill each other. He was given a massive sword.
Okay, well, this second horse is not so much of a mystery. I think it's interesting that these are two separate horses. So the first one is almost positive in its connotations. We have a white horse. The rider was concerned with victory and conquest. Those are positives, at least for the winners of the conflict. But here, with the red horse, there's no talk of glory. There's just war. There's just death and a lack of peace. It's interesting to wonder, how is this connected to the first horse? Are they teams? Is this a 1-2 punch? Or are these adversaries in some way? Does the red horse just represent the chaos and disorder of the fighting caused by the disruption that the rider on the white horse has caused? Also, the fact that this rider is said to have been given a massive sword, I think, implies that they had some sort of formidable weapon or military power. And so, this one is a bit of a mystery. I'm not sure how much it's connected to the first horse, how much it's intentional, or how long this phase will last. And we do know that these are phases, and that there is a third one coming. And in the next clip, we're going to hear some strange things that relate to economic concerns. Concerns about coinage and food cost. Inflation, you might say. That's not something we have to deal with. Surely this is completely different. Let's hear.
When the Lamb broke the third seal, I heard the third creature say, "Come." I looked, and I saw a black horse, Its rider held a pair of scales in his hand. I heard something from among the 4 creatures that sounded like a voice saying, 1 denarius for 1 quart of wheat, or 3 quarts of barley, and don't damage the oil or the wine.
And so I think we're hinting at a famine here, but not one caused by bad weather or locusts. This seems to be about coinage and food supply. And so does that mean that this is an artificial famine? In other words, a famine caused by economic problems and by trade route shutdowns and by uncertainties of transportation and travel? And so these are problems that are being caused by the war and the political disruption, not necessarily by some sort of bad streak of weather. And this aside about not damaging the oil or the wine, and talking about the cost of a quart of wheat or 3 quarts of barley, which barley was always seen as lesser than in terms of food quality. Barley bread was given to prisoners, while finely milled wheat bread was for the wealthy. And being very careful with oil and wine implies that they are in short supply, very expensive, and designated for the wealthy, not for the likes of you. And now, if you think I lost my mind with that translation, let's go ahead and listen to the King James Version, just to see what the classic standard translation is. Let's hear what our King James translators came up with.
And when he had opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd beast say, Come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 beasts say, A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see thou hurt not the oil and the wine.
Well, that didn't help us much in terms of trying to figure out what the passage is really trying to describe. But it's clear that we're looking at some sort of economic problem. An economic problem that affects the food supply in an adverse way and makes certain goods rare and thus extremely expensive. One thing I wanted to mention is the timing. I think the timing is interesting and a little bit backwards from what we might expect. For example, a lot of historians have talked about how World War II in the 1940s started as the result of the global Great Depression of the early 1930s. In other words, the war and the devastation came because of the economic problems. That the economic problems happened first, and then that triggered all the fighting. Here, it seems to be the reverse. It's not the 20th century model of big wars. Here you have some guy on the white horse who decides to conquer more land. We have some sort of ambitious leadership force that arises. And this leads to the red horse, which leads, in other words, to a lot of people being killed, in particular perhaps by an unusual or formidable weapon. And then we're left with this strange passage about people having trouble sourcing enough food. And this economic problem came as the result of the victory. This is what happens after someone steals peace. Note that once war happened and then peace happened after World War II, for certain countries, including the United States, you have 2 decades of the strongest economic growth in history. The 1950s and 1960s in the United States were not an era of privation and worry about food. That's going to be the 2050s and the 2060s. But the 1950s and the 1960s were pretty fun from what I can tell. The 2 decades that followed the worst war in human history were some of the happiest times in human history. Here we seem to have the reverse. And so these are not economic problems that are part of a natural business cycle. They're not due to drought or uncertainties in climate. And so the order of the horses may also reflect, what if this economic devastation is deliberate? Here's another lesson we can learn from the 20th century. What if this is economic control and not deprivation? Something similar to Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward, where you have about 30 million people just disappear. What a great leap. And so, what if this is food rationing by a government? What if the short supply is something that's intentional and well managed? Well, to the extent that anything is well managed up to this point, all hell is literally about to break loose. So let's see what happens when the lamb breaks the 4th seal.
Then, when the lamb broke the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th creature saying, "Come." I looked, and I saw a pale green horse. Its rider was named Death, and the underworld followed behind him. They were given control over 1/4 of the earth, to kill by the sword, and by starvation, and by plague, and by the wild animals of the earth.
So I've got to admit, this is one of my favorite lines, and this is one of the passages that triggered my goal to do this series and just walk through the entire Revelation to John once and for all. It's a pretty iconic and badass line, one of the most metal verses of the Bible. There's also been a lot of thought and discussion about the color of this particular horse. He says, "I looked and I beheld a horse of a particular color. Kai eidon, kai idu, hippos chloros." Hippos is a horse. Hippopotamos means a river horse. And there's a story there about how the hippopotamus got its name, but just know that hippos, which would be transliterated Hippos, that's how you say horse in Greek. So the name Philip comes from Philippos, which is Greek for horse lover, someone who is quite fond of horses. It's a very manly, noble name. At least that's what it sounds like to someone listening in antiquity. Hippos chloros. This chloros would be transliterated as CHLOROS. And that's a long O, the omega in the first instance there. So CHLOROS. That should seem a little familiar. Kind of reminds us of bleach, chlorine, or Clorox. Chloros literally just means a pale green color. It just means pale green, light green. In many other Greek texts, including the Bible, it's translated just green. It boils down to an idiom that refers to someone looking pale or sick. Kind of like how in cartoons people turn green when they seem to be nauseated. This is an image of a horse with a bizarre, unhealthy, unnatural color. And it's a little bit jarring, and as you probably can recall, a lot of translations don't involve this green color. Sometimes they'll just focus on this sickly element of the description, and they'll talk about an ashen horse. Or, as we'll see here, in the King James Version, they didn't mention the green part. They went ahead and just went with this idea that we're talking about something sickly looking. And we already had a white horse. So it's interesting. They went ahead and gave us the famous image of the pale horse. But this pale horse is really pale green. So let's hear what the King James translators did.
And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, Come and see. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth.
Wow. Imagine that a fourth part of the earth was killed with swords, and you survived that. Another part was killed with hunger, and you survived that. But then you get all that way just to be killed by death. Kind of sucks to be killed by death. The Greek literally does say killed with death, but it's an idiom referring to plague, in the same way that the Black Death referred to a plague event much later on. So these people who were killed by death were killed by what modern people would say disease. But bear in mind that the difference between disease and just death is something that we make a big deal about in the modern world after microscopes and germ theory. But infectious disease, being killed by microbes in antiquity, was a pretty mysterious and terrifying thing. Suddenly someone gets a high fever, then they can't leave their bed, and they're delirious for a week, and then they just die. There was no test they could run to see what was actually going on. Now we would demand that the hospital give us some sort of diagnosis based on what microorganisms were cultured in the sample from that person's body. And we demand some sort of name be given to the microorganism responsible. But in antiquity, why bother? You didn't know. And so that's where you get these very broad statements like being killed by death. It was a very different world. People were, quote-unquote, killed by death all the time back then. They just didn't feel the need to be as specific as we do. I think that it is helpful to occasionally shift between translations to see how different people deal with the choices that you have to make. And here, not only did we have the difficulty with the color of the horse, but this peculiar thing we have here where John is not saying that the being was actually death. He simply said that the name of the rider was Death. And it's given like it's the person's given name or title. I mean, I think we can all see that this is probably allegorical, but it's just interesting and peculiar to introduce death this way, because this naming thing has not occurred before, didn't happen with the other riders. And then the fact that this rider had a very shocking or surprising +1 that they brought with them. And that is the entire contents of the underworld, or Hades, or Hell, depending on your translation. I also find it interesting that John definitely talks about people being killed by the beasts of the earth. And that's sort of a shocking image, back then as well as now, because by the 1st century AD, people were very, very rarely killed by large animals. And just like the world of today, is this an echo of stories of martyrdom in the arenas where people were fed to wild animals for amusement? That apparently did occur on some occasions, and I think that the surviving literature may overstate the commonality or the public acceptance of that sort of thing. But as far as we can tell, it did occur, at least at some points. There was a particular kind of horror of this idea of people being condemned to or left to being killed by wild animals, but it's definitely there. And I'm not sure what John was seeing or what the purpose of that was. He's certainly not specific about what kind of animals. And now, after all this death, the Lamb is about to break the fifth seal. And this one is a little different. Let's see what happens.
When the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I looked beneath the altar, and I saw the souls of those who were killed because of the word of God, and because of the testimony they upheld. They cried out, "Master, you are holy and truthful. When will you bring judgment and take vengeance for our blood from the people who live on the earth?" Each of these souls was given a white robe, and they were told to rest for a little longer until their fellow servants and their brothers, those who will soon be killed as they were, could also be fulfilled.
So this is interesting. Breaking the fifth seal does not summon a horse or a rider. It is a revelation of a crime. It's the unveiling of a number of people who were killed because of what they believed, or as John says, the testimony they upheld, the story they stuck to, the belief they wouldn't give up. And this is a pretty grim image, and it shows the grim situation that the Christians were facing. Remember, as I mentioned before, this is the generation of Christians that are growing up after the execution of Peter and Paul. And as I mentioned before, the Roman persecution of Christians was wide-ranging in severity and sporadic in terms of chronology. It ranged from what we would call mere social exclusion, although that had serious effects in antiquity, which we talked about a little bit earlier, all the way up to full-on mass executions. And there was usually a constant drumbeat of all the terrible things in between that could happen to you as a Christian. And so, let's take a moment to think about, why did the Romans hate the Christians so much? Your typical, traditional, elite Roman, so dead set against this new philosophical threat to the Roman world. This criminal superstition that was rotting people's minds. I think that you can see why certain elites among the Romans hated Christianity, because it was a great combination of a lot of things that they already hated. The Romans hated new things. For them, religion and one's duties to the gods and to their ancestors was something that was defined a long time ago, and people had no right to innovate in that area. And so, just the fact that it was a new religion sounded strange to the Romans, because religions are old. They're about things that happened a long time ago. About the great Bronze Age heroes. The Romans even accepted that Judaism was a valid religion, even though they certainly didn't want to participate and found the people who followed that religion to be extremely problematic, but it was legal. It was okay to be Jewish in the Roman world. Not so for Christianity. And one of the main reasons is that Judaism is very old. The Romans understood that this ethnicity called the Israelites showed up before Rome was founded, and that Moses was a hero from the Bronze Age. He lived around 1200 BC. And so, for Romans living around 100 AD, Moses was certainly old. The old laws in Deuteronomy against eating pork and that sort of thing was something that the Romans could understand. They were thinking, these are the old laws that your ancestors wrote down before the Bronze Age collapse. So, yes, that makes sense. But it's still the case that the Romans had come to see the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas as a treacherous and violent, extreme, and primitive people. And then to have a religion, a brand new religion, being founded by a small band of Jewish criminals? Are you kidding me? And this is taking over? So the Romans hated new things. Christianity was new. The Romans, let's just face it, were pretty extreme anti-Semites due to the problems that they had had for decades in the Middle East. And Christianity was definitely, to some extent, Jewish in the Roman mind. That was a problem. The Romans didn't like Eastern things in general. Stuff from the Eastern Mediterranean was always suspect, whether it was people, words, food, crops, animals, political ideas. The West was this wild country full of tough, independent farmers, and they were seen as freer than the gigantic states in the East, where everyone was constantly on their knees and forehead on the floor in front of some Eastern despot. The Romans didn't want that world. They eventually got it, but they didn't want it. And let's face it, the Romans didn't really like Greek stuff either. And that, of course, was the dominant culture in the Eastern Mediterranean. But here you had Christians who were bringing in this belief system that was almost as Greek as it was Jewish. It was all these things that they didn't like coming from the East. And Christianity was usurping the Roman social order. I mean, now people could meet on Sunday morning in their courtyards and meet with friends and worship God and build a community that way. They didn't need these giant stone temples and statues anymore. They didn't need state-sponsored shrines and parades. They didn't need to butcher hundreds of bulls for Zeus anymore. But this was a problem. How can you maintain public order when people don't respect the old gods and don't follow the ancestral traditions? They want to adopt this bizarre superstition of some Eastern foreigner Jewish criminal, this rabbi magician from Galilee. This is the kind of trendy thinking and extreme open-mindedness that will destroy the empire. And then, worst of all, when people convert to Christianity, they become terrible Romans. Christians were not good Romans. First of all, they were pacifists. They weren't enthusiastic about the next batch of wars that the nobility had in store for them. They didn't participate in public festivals. And then the wealthy Christians weren't as productive and actually lost money because a lot of them would free their slaves while they were still alive, by the way. Meaning, yes, they actually got credit for it. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? You can see how Christianity just didn't fit. It didn't fit the Roman order. Now, there was a guy who was going to see the Matrix. He was going to understand what needed to happen here. But he won't come around for a while. Right around the early 300s AD, there was a Roman emperor named Constantine, often called Constantine the Great. Interesting guy. He never set foot in Italy until after he claimed the throne, the purple. And he grew up mostly in Britain. So Constantine the Great grows up in Britain, and on top of that, is more comfortable speaking Greek than Latin. He founds Constantinople, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and pretty much shifts the political weight of the empire to the east. And more administration in the East was being done in Greek, and it was becoming very culturally Greek, very culturally Christian. And so, just know the dying pagan Roman world would fuse with this new, vibrant Christian culture. and create a kind of fusion between the old worlds. In other words, we'll build more new, bigger stone temples, but we'll call them churches or cathedrals. We're going to swap out our priesthood of Zeus and Mars, etc., for the Christian leaders. Now, who were the Christian leaders at the time? The episkopoi. The episkopoi were the overseers or the leaders over the Christian churches. And it's a Greek word that just means overseer. Episkopos. Episkopos. And I don't know if that word sounds a little familiar, but once again, thanks to French phonetic perversion, the word turned into bishop. And so the bishops were just the early leaders and overseers of the churches. And in the early days, especially before Christianity was legalized, they were often the founders of that church. So it's interesting that we are focusing on the persecution and the deaths of Christians with this seal, but with the next seal, we are definitely returning to celestial events or events in the larger world. And so let's see what happens next.
When the Lamb broke the sixth seal, there was a huge earthquake. The sun turned black, like haircloth, and the entire moon became like blood. The stars in the sky fell down to earth, the same way a fig tree scatters its unripe fruit when shaken by a gust of wind. The sky retreated like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and every island was moved out of its place.
Okay, well, there is some bizarre imagery here, and lots of it. A lot of things just happened. First was a seismos megas, and if you recall the term seismology, you remember that seismos is an earthquake in Greek, and megas, M-E-G-A-S, I think we've all seen that prefix before. So there was a big earthquake. And then the sun turned black. And you can't get any plainer and clearer than this Greek. Helios, Helios, where we get the word helium from. Egeneto, it became, it turned into. Melas. And that's where we get the term melanoma or the skin pigment melanin that makes your skin dark. And so the sun became melas, hos sakos, just like sackcloth. Trichinos, which means of hair, made out of hair. So we have to think of a dull, very dark brown, black sun. Then the moon, it says the moon, che selene, hole, meaning all of it, egeneto, like before, it means turned into or became, hos, there's the word as again, haima, that would be transliterated H-A-I-M-A, and haima is blood in Greek. It's the origin of the heme part of words like hemoglobin or leukemia. Now, what does all this dramatic global catastrophe stuff mean? Well, I have a definite theory. There's a lot of information here, actually. But first, of course, I need to diverge off the topic and talk about office politics. We got to talk about suck-ups, brown-nosers, or, as the fancy folk might call them, sycophants. S-Y-C-O-P-H-A-N-T-S. Now, why am I talking about sycophants? Well, this passage talks about figs. That's why. Of course. And the Greek word for fig is psyche. Psyche. You would transliterate that S-Y-K and then a long E. If we were to get in a time machine and zap ourselves back into ancient Greece and we came across a fig orchard, we might see one group of people set up a special net that surrounds the tree on all sides. And then other groups of men would shake the tree. They would grab the trunk and they would shake the tree as hard as they could. And this would cause the ripe figs to go ahead and fall down into the nets. Ancient Greeks, watching the men shaking the trees like this, would call them sukopantes. Sukopantes, which in Greek means guys who make the figs appear. The guys who make the figs show up. Pantes, which would be transliterated Phantes. That Phant might look familiar. That's where we get a lot of words in English from, phantom or phenomenon. And these words just relate to things that appear, things that show up to be seen, a thing that we observe. And so we kept the word sycophant, but we forgot what it meant originally. We forgot the metaphorical meaning. I suppose the fig tree is the important person. The ripe figs are the favors or the crumbs ready to fall. And the shaking of the tree is the actual sucking up part. Now, before we move on to analyze these celestial events very closely, let's make sure that we've zeroed in on the details. Let's make sure that we've got the wording right. And so, as a double check, let's once again check back with the King James translators to see how they rendered this dramatic image. Let's hear.
And I beheld, when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs, when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed, as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places.
Okay, so it seems like the King James is on the same page. They just used some more antiquated constructions, but let's see what we can make of all this celestial imagery. First off, let's recap what just happened. First, the sun turns black, and the moon turns red. Those are the big ones. Then, one implication of the stars having fallen down from the sky is that they are no longer visible in the sky. So, this is an image of an entirely black sky. The sky at night is blotted out. And so, if we put all three of those together, it seems pretty clear that we're describing an atmospheric problem. There is dust, smoke, or debris of some kind in the air that, for example, we often have situations where the moon appears red. It's anytime the moon is caught in the Earth's penumbra, its secondary shadow. The way to think of it is that because of the chemical composition of our atmosphere, of the sky, when a beam of light, let's say this is a beam of white light, comes in straight as an arrow from the sun, and it crashes into molecules in our atmosphere. It turns out that the shorter the wavelength, in other words, the cooler the color, the more the light is shifted to the blue or violet end of the spectrum, it gets bent. It gets turned to the side, knocked off at an angle. And the more air the light passes through, the more this happens. The part of the white light that is closer to the red or yellow end of the spectrum, in other words, a longer wavelength, they don't get as scattered. They're not bent as much. They keep going straight. And that creates a weird thing where the more air white sunlight passes through, the redder it gets. the more the blue is stripped out of it and kicked around into the air. And that's why the sky during the day, when there's tons of sunlight cascading around in the molecules of the atmosphere, that's when the sky looks nice and bright blue. But then when we see the sun through a lot more air, meaning when it's near the horizon and we're having to look down through many more miles of air at the sun, all that air strips away the blue, and all we start seeing is more and more red light coming from the sun. That's exactly what happens whenever we see the moon cast in a red shadow. It's the ragged edge of the sunlight going past the earth and getting some of the blue light stripped out by our atmosphere. Now, back to these stars. I don't think John is actually saying that these gigantic spheres of fusing hydrogen and helium gas will collide with the Earth. I think what he's describing is a meteor or debris shower. In other words, if the sky is blotted out where suddenly you can't see the actual stars, but all you can see is a constant rain of bright, shiny, burning stuff falling down through the atmosphere, when the stars are no longer visible, I can see how that looks like the stars fell down out of the sky. And then we have the hail and fire mixed with blood. This sounds very strange, but it seems pretty clear to me that this is describing a pyroclastic flow from a volcanic eruption, or superheated ejecta, which would be fine dust and debris falling back into the atmosphere after it's been blasted up into low orbit by the impact of an asteroid. And also this asteroid, if the asteroid is of a sufficient size, the impact with the Earth will activate volcanoes through the seismic shock. That would increase the amount of volcanic ash in the air. And this material is, of course, superheated. It would cause the temperature of the air to reach the ignition point. This is definitely a situation that could cause fires that would burn a third of all the land on Earth. The sky retreating like a scroll, that one stumps me. And as you can see, it's a pretty clear statement in Greek, and the King James had to deal with it, kind of like I did. So we'll have to think more about that one. But the strangest one makes perfect sense. He says that he saw that after all this happened, every mountain and island was moved out of its place. Believe it or not, that makes perfect sense. After extreme tectonic activity, you absolutely do see landmarks move in relation to one another. Now, normally this is not going to be a difference of miles or kilometers, but absolutely in terms of meters and yards. We're not talking inches. After the earthquake that struck Japan in 2011, what they call the Higashi Nihon Daishinsai, and that means the Great Eastern Japanese Earthquake. That was the earthquake, if you recall, that caused the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster. Now, that earthquake was extremely huge. In terms of the Richter scale, it was a 9, which puts it as almost maximum for what we would call normal tectonic activity. Now, there were some points on the Earth, offshore, not on the land of Japan, but some ways off the coast. If you were to measure 2 points before the earthquake and after the earthquake, they would be 50 meters apart. So we had things moving 50 meters. And the earthquake lasted for 6 minutes. We had an earthquake that was a 9 on the Richter scale, caused movement for 6 minutes. And we had some parts of the Earth that moved 50 meters. That was one extreme measurement, but in general, the entire island of Honshu, the big one, the big main island in the middle of the Japanese archipelago, that entire island moved 2.5 meters, roughly 8 feet, during that 6 minutes. The land along the fault lines shifted that far. The entire island, 2.5 meters. it's easy to remember that Honshu is the main island of Japan because Honshu in Japanese means, you guessed it, the main island. So this was about as strong as normal earthquakes get. But what about non-normal earthquakes? What am I talking about when I say non-normal? Well, let's look at the last very well-studied asteroid impact that happened 66 million years ago near the Yucatan Peninsula. And they call this impact site the Chicxulub Impact Crater. And Chicxulub is spelled Chicxulub. It's a Mayan term, not a Spanish word. Geologists estimate that this impact from this asteroid caused earthquakes that were at least 100 times more powerful. Now, the Richter scale is logarithmic, so we're talking earthquakes of magnitude 11 or 12. But just know that those are much more powerful than the largest earthquakes that we would normally expect to see. And these earthquakes that would be so much more powerful would also last significantly longer than 6 minutes. And you'd have thousands of these really powerful earthquakes reoccurring over the course of weeks. So, if we extrapolate from what we see in normal earthquakes and what we saw in 2011, we could say that after an event like this, after an asteroid impact, you would absolutely have mountains and islands that had moved miles away from their original place. You'd have to redraw some local maps. Now, local maps of what? Anything remotely close to the impact site would be completely destroyed. If not by the shockwave, it would be burned by the ejecta and the flow of superheated gas and volcanic ash. And so the aftermath of this is not going to be great. So what are the people going to do? John describes a little bit about the reaction of the survivors after this event. And I can imagine they're not going to be in a good place. And let's hear what John has to say about what in the world happens to the people after the impact. Let's hear.
And the kings of the earth, the elites, the commanders, the rich, the strong, every slave, and every free person, all hid themselves away in caves and among the rocks in the mountains. They said to the mountains and to the rocks, "Fall down on us. Hide us from the face of the one who sits on the throne. Hide us from the fury of the Lamb, because their great day of wrath has come. And who could endure it?"
Well, that was thorough. That does seem to be everybody. John piles up a lot of terms to make sure that we get the sense of, to paraphrase Gary Oldman from The Professional, that movie in the 90s where he was acting along a very young Natalie Portman. The French actor's name was Jean Reno. In that movie, Gary Oldman, our villain, orders one of his henchmen to gather up everyone. And he's unclear about exactly who that is, and so he clarifies, "You mean everyone?" And Gary Oldman turns to him and screams in his face, "Everyone!" And that's pretty much who is fleeing into the mountains. Everyone. And they don't have a whole lot of hope for their future. I think it's impossible not to find some kind of ironic contradiction there between the connotation of the word fury and the word lamb. So these people are driven to insanity by their fear and horror of the fury of the lamb. You normally don't think of lambs as being furious. And so, why are these people fleeing to mountains and trying to hide in caves? I think that's interesting. They seem to be fleeing to high ground or places where they can get away from being exposed to the atmosphere. If the impact occurred in the ocean, there would be slightly less burning and less volcanic activity, but not that much less. The ocean isn't deep enough to matter that much to an asteroid when we're talking about cosmic distances and speeds. Now, one big difference would be that an ocean impact would create massive tsunamis. I think we're all familiar with that idea, but just bear in mind, these would not be normal tsunamis. We're talking waves 50 meters tall of solid ocean that could easily knock down skyscrapers like bowling pins. And so I imagine that these are Europeans fleeing into the Alps, or Americans fleeing into the Rockies, Chileans fleeing into the Andes. It's difficult to say. But they do seem to be fleeing devastation that you would see in lowland areas or on coastlines. And once again, one last time for this volume, let's check in with the King James crew and see if they're down with my translation or if they've got beef.
And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man hid themselves in the dens, and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?
Well, we're going to end today with that lovely, hopeful image. I think we've had enough death and destruction for one session. But unfortunately, we're kind of just getting started. Believe it or not, this is just the calm before the storm. We're going to see more celestial events with more detail coming in future volumes. And there's been a long debate about exactly how many celestial disasters are described in the book, because a lot of them seem to overlap. John may very well be describing the same events multiple times. So we're certainly not done with terrible things falling out of the sky. And I think at this point, we're all starting to get a really good feel for how this is unfolding. If you look carefully at the text, you'll see that John's visions are very emotional and intuitive rather than visual or verbal. In other words, to give an example, he writes that he saw a pale green horse. Okay, we get that. He had a vision and he described what he saw. But then he says that the writer's name was Death. How do you know that? No one in the throne room said, Hey, by the way, that guy on the horse, he calls himself Death. He's a real weirdo. Steer clear of him. John just somehow knew it. I hate to bring this up, but people who interact with the NHI often get a sense of, well, I just knew it, or I could just feel it. They get that sensation all the time. And all of this seems to be related to ideas being put into people's heads instead of simple talking. So we can see John get ideas in his head that are not verbalized all through the book. And I find that strange. Or let me say it this way. It's a strange coincidence. Reminds me of a movie from 2005 that's a guilty pleasure of mine. Signs, one of M. Night Shyamalan's genius films. And in that one, Mel Gibson's character, at one point, tells Joaquin Phoenix's character about his feelings about the impending alien invasion. And it's a great monologue. Mel Gibson is a good actor, regardless of anyone's estimation of his mental health. During this monologue, his character asks, what if there are no coincidences? And I think that's an important mental exercise to do. I would go so far as to say that I believe in coincidences. logically, you have to understand that statistically they will occur. But I don't trust in coincidences. In other words, there are certain times when I'm going to hold out the possibility that the universe is trying to tell us something. I think we have to. I think that's an imperative of what it means to be alive and sentient and intelligent. I think that once you stop looking for signs in the universe, once you throw your hands up and say that it's all coincidence, there's something about being alive that you've lost. It's a kind of striving or hope for the future. And so I think it's helpful to always have an eye out for messages from the forces at work that we know are out there, but we normally don't see. And I think John saw something. He got a message. It could be mostly noise, and the signal that he had in his vision was drowned out by personal politics, his limited perceptions of technology and culture from his time, his personal concerns about the church organizations and the threat from Rome. Or maybe he was really onto something. Maybe his vision was a true peek behind the curtain. We will certainly continue our journey with John in Volume 5. We'll be hitting some other topics in the next episodes, but we will definitely come back to finish out our casual stroll through the Revelation to John. So until then, I'll talk to you later.